Hey guys, tonight, we slip quietly into the shadows of the past. No grand castles here, no shiny knights or rose-tinted romances. Just flickering torchlight on damp stone, the smell of boiled leather and betrayal, and the low murmur of secrets that refused to die. You're walking into a world where kings bathed in wine queens signed death warrants between love letters, and bishops gave communion with one hand and assassinated rivals with the other. And you, well, you're just trying to survive the night without ending up in a poisoned banquet or some suspiciously friendly monastery. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are. I'd love to see who else is up right now, wandering these dark hallways with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink, and suddenly you're standing in the half-lit ruins of the Western Roman Empire. It's the 5th century, and the ground beneath your feet trembles not from earthquakes, but from collapsing laws, broken alliances, and way too many people calling themselves emperor while holding a rusty sword and a decent tailor. The world has cracked open, and what's oozing out is not quite chaos. It's worse, desperate ambition. And in that dangerous void, scandal becomes not just gossip, but governance. You're not in some fairy tale version of the Dark Ages. There's no armor-polishing montages or cheerful feasts here. This is where things fall apart, and when they do, the opportunists crawl out. Your first brush with scandal isn't with a king or queen, it's with the idea of power itself. Imagine you're a provincial noble. Rome's authority has gone soft, almost syrupy, like overcooked barley. The legions are gone. The taxes are still due. And your neighbors are starting to eye your estate like it's the last wine jug at the party. What do? You lie, cheat, and marry your way upward. That's the new diplomacy. Everywhere former Roman elites scramble to tie themselves to the new warlords. You see bishops marrying off their nieces to semi-literate war chiefs, calling it divine guidance. You see Latin scrolls altered to insert heroic ancestries. One guy even claims descent from Hercules. Bold. Then there's the church, the church. It tries to be the moral compass, but its needle spins wildly in this storm. Popes rise and fall like tavern rumors. Some are poisoned, others are dragged out of crypts and put on trial. Yes, a corpse trial is coming up, don't fall asleep just yet. Even holy relics become currency. Need an army, offer someone the real finger of St. Peter. Or maybe 3 of them just in case. Historians still argue whether the Dark Ages were truly dark or just badly lit. But one thing's for sure, they were scandal-prone. And it wasn't limited to the big names. Picture a Frankish peasant sneaking into his local monastery to confess sins he hasn't committed yet, just to gossip with the priest about who has. Whispers are the true currency. You move through them now like smoke. Here's one, a noblewoman in Aquitaine, poisons her brother to inherit his land, but pins it on the cook. The cook is executed, of course. She then marries the judge who condemned him. Efficient a Saxon warlord, builds a shrine not for a saint, but for his dead horse. He claims it neighed 3 times before dying, and that means something. He gets 50 followers. 2 years later, he's king. People are desperate, and desperate people follow anything with a story attached. Even the calendar isn't safe from scandal. When Pope Gregory eventually reforms it in the late 16th century, guess what? He has to skip 10 whole days to fix things. But where did those 10 days go? Some monks claim it was to erase the anniversary of a secret exorcism that nearly unseated a pope in the 9th century. Totally unfounded, of course. Probably. Meanwhile, relic trafficking is all the rage. You brush shoulders with merchants selling splinters of the true cross by the dozen conveniently carved from local driftwood. One church in Gaul claims to own the holy foreskin. Another 600 miles away says it has the holy foreskin. A third says theirs glows. You can't make this up. But someone did. The most valuable thing you carry in this world isn't a sword, it's a rumor. And you carry one now that a Byzantine empress once performed in salacious pantomimes before marrying into imperial purple. That one will take you to Constantinople soon, where silk curtains hide more than skin. But for now, walk with me through these alleys of half-truths and hushed sins. You'll meet kings who stole their brothers' wives, queens who assassinated popes, and monks who ruled cities with one hand on the Bible and the other on a dagger. You'll see how scandal isn't a deviation from power. It's the very fuel that drives it forward in these shadow-thick centuries. You sidestep a priest with blood on his cuffs and pass a Roman senator holding court in what used to be a bathhouse, now a wine cellar. You peek into a monastery and catch a scribe writing one history for the church and another for his mistress. This is not a clean time. It's not even a clean story. But it's yours now. Welcome to the bedtime history no school ever dared teach. You slip quietly into the gold-drenched corridors of Constantinople, your sandals muted by velvet rugs and whispers. Empress Theodora walks just ahead of you, chin-lifted eyes like obsidian daggers and silk robes that whisper louder than the courtiers who bow too low. You're not sure if it's reverence or fear that keeps their eyes downcast. Maybe both. You're in her world now, and she didn't claw her way up from the gutter just to be ignored. Byzantium glows with opulence, but the gold's been polished over rot. The palace is full of secrets carved in stone and stitched into tapestries. And Theodora, she might be the juiciest of them all. Once she was a stage performer, no scratch that a performer in the most eyebrow-raising sense. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who couldn't decide if he was obsessed with her or repulsed, paints a picture that modern scholars eye skeptically, but with a raised brow. He claimed she danced in plays that were, let's say, extremely interactive. One story alleges she mimed Leda and the Swan, using actual grain and birds. You're trying not to imagine it. Good call. Now, historians still argue whether Procopius's salacious secret history is libel satire or the hottest Byzantine gossip rag of its day. But even filtered through scandal, Theodora's rise remains astonishing. Born into poverty, her father a bear trainer in the circus, and her mother a dancer, she spun her life like silk, one thread at a time. From performer to mistress to powerful empress beside Justinian, she remade herself so thoroughly even marble statues seem to bow. You trail her through palace halls adorned with mosaics that sparkle like broken promises. She doesn't smile often. When she does, it's usually before something unfortunate happens to one of her enemies. When the Nika riots explode, threatening to rip the city apart, it's Theodora who saves the throne. While Justinian contemplates fleeing, she stands tall, draped in imperial purple voice cold as iron, and delivers a line that freezes the room. Purple makes a fine burial shroud. She'd rather die a ruler than live as a refugee. You believe her. She then suggests, as empresses do, that perhaps the rebellion could be resolved more efficiently. Soon, nearly 30,000 rioters are slaughtered in the hippodrome. Theodora doesn't flinch. You, however, might need a sip of wine. But there's another side to her, shadowed but real. She opens women's shelters for former prostitutes. She pushes reforms that give women more autonomy in divorce and property. She doesn't just wield power, she uses it sometimes cruelly, sometimes compassionately. Think of her as the scalpel and the balm. You never quite know which side you'll get. Her relationship with the church is equally layered. She sides with the Monophysites, a heretical sect, in the eyes of Orthodox clergy. Why some say faith, others say politics. She builds her own network of loyal bishops and ensures their protection. Her enemies grumble, but they keep quiet. It's hard to protest when your predecessor vanished mid-sermon. And yet, despite all her power, she's still the subject of gossip at every banquet. One senator jokes she knows more about the stage than the scriptures. By morning, he's retired to a coastal estate, in exile, with no boat. Theodora dies relatively young, possibly of cancer. Justinian mourns her deeply and never remarries. Her mosaics survive in Ravenna, where she still gazes down, imperious and unreadable. Look closely at her eyes. Next time you see one, they're not smiling. Now here's your quirky fringe tidbit. There's a theory whispered even among scholars that Theodora kept a secret troupe of dancers and actors in the palace long after her marriage. Not for performances, no one was invited. Just to keep her grounded, or perhaps to remember who she used to be. Some claim she'd visit them alone, watching silently from behind a curtain. Others think she kept them as a sort of living revenge proof that she had risen while they remained. Is it true? We'll never know. But it fits, doesn't it? As you leave the Empress behind your head, spinning with conflicting impressions, saint, schemer, savior, siren, you can't help but notice something strange. For all the scandalous stories about her early life, Theodora never bothered to deny a single one. Not once. Maybe she knew something the rest of us forget. When you've survived lions' riots and emperors, a little scandal is practically perfume. You step out of her court with a head full of golden lies and silver truths. Byzantium glitters on, but tonight the shadows glitter more. You leave the perfumed intrigues of Constantinople behind and find yourself surrounded by Frankish forests, thick with mist and the smell of moss. A hunting horn echoes in the distance, low, mournful, and slightly off-key. And just ahead, lit by flickering torches, a royal tent flaps in the wind. Inside, Charlemagne, or as you're expected to call him, Charles the Great. You push past the tent flap, expecting majesty. Instead, you find boots scattered like children's toys, goblets half full of warm ale and fur blankets in very suspicious piles. Because for all his empire building, Charlemagne wasn't just father of Europe. He might have also been father of France, Germany, Italy, and a few noble households he never officially acknowledged. Charlemagne, the man who unified most of Western Europe, who crowned himself Emperor of the Romans, who standardized weights and measures like a bureaucratic Zeus, was also an old-school romantic. Except romantic here means taking multiple wives, concubines, and handmaids, and mixing it all together like some kind of royal fondue. His official biographer, Einhard, walks a weird line between reverence and polite panic. He notes that Charlemagne never allowed his daughters to marry ever, but somehow they kept turning up with babies. Mystery. Even the court knew what was happening, but no one dared ask. They just kept naming children after bishops and pretending nothing weird was going on. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne truly forbade his daughters' marriages out of jealousy strategy or sheer fatherly overreach. Some believe he just didn't want other nobles using his daughters to claw at the throne. Others think he liked keeping them close, too close, according to a few scandalous monk letters from the Abbey of Reichenau. Those monks never named names, but they definitely left eyebrows permanently raised. And then there's the wife math. Officially, Charlemagne had 5, or was it 6 wives, depending on whom you ask. Unofficially, the number of concubines bounces around more than his campaign routes. One early lover, Himmeltrude, may have been his first wife, or just a conveniently discarded mistress once a better political match came along. Records blur. Intentional, perhaps, you trail the emperor to Aachen, his gleaming capital. The palace chapel sparkles with imported marble, and the eerie shimmer of incense smoke. Outside, peasants cheer his victories. Inside, his children fill every corner, often with different mothers. His court clerks, exhausted, have started reusing names just to keep track. Another Pepin fine. Add a Roman numeral. Here's your fringe tidbit. One document claims Charlemagne insisted on personally choosing the tutors for each of his many illegitimate children. He made sure they could read, write Latin, and recite scriptures, even if their mothers couldn't spell their own names. The guy ruled like a patriarchal supercomputer. And you know what? It worked. Mostly. His bastard children went on to become abbots, bishops, generals, even kings. Charlemagne was building dynasties like some men collect coins. He didn't care about church scolding. He simply outlived most of his critics. But not all the family dramas played out quietly. One wife, Desiderata, the daughter of the Lombard king, was married and then unceremoniously dismissed within a year. The Pope reportedly hated the match from the start. Charlemagne tossed her back like a bad bet. Not long after, he invaded Lombardy and erased her father's kingdom. Coincidence? You know better by now. Einhard writes that Charlemagne loved the company of women, which is medieval biography code for brace yourself, there's more. But what's often overlooked is that Charlemagne seemed to love his children too genuinely. He dined with them, took them on military campaigns, even taught them to swim. Most rulers barely knew their heirs. Charlemagne raised his like a dad, a very complicated empire-building, rule-bending dad. And here's where it gets thorny. After all that effort, most of his work unraveled within a generation. His legitimate heir, Louis the Pious, spent his reign trying to hold the empire together with parchment and prayer beads. His other sons, both legitimate and less so, competed like drunken heirs in a game of kingdom Jenga. Spoiler, it fell. But that legacy, oh, it stuck. Modern France and Germany both claim him as a founding father. His name was evoked by Napoleon Hitler and the European Union, which you have to admit is a pretty strange crew to share a fan club. You step out into the forest again, listening to the last echoes of Charlemagne's court, a blend of choir chants, infant screams, and the gentle scraping of marriage contracts being rewritten in candlelight. Here's a question you don't hear in textbooks. Can someone be holy and scandalous at the same time? Charlemagne made sure you'd have to wonder. The forest grows thicker, darker. You duck under sagging pine branches and step over roots like knotted veins. Then stone beneath your feet. Cracked tiles. A Roman bathhouse repurposed into a fortress. Welcome to Ravenna, late 5th century. You're about to meet Theodoric, the great Ostrogothic king, Roman in name only, and one of the most polite murderers you'll ever hear about. Theodoric looks like someone sculpted him from mountain rock. Beard, braided cloak, pinned with a brooch shaped like a wolf's head. He claims to be the guardian of Rome's traditions, but you notice something strange. He doesn't smile. Ever. And when he speaks, his voice is careful. Calculated. Like a man who knows words can kill but prefers to let other people do the stabbing. You'd think Theodoric, ruling in the shell of a fallen empire, would try to bring order. And sure, he does on paper. He lets Roman law stay in place. He keeps the Senate. He even builds churches and baths to soothe the anxious populace. But underneath all this borrowed civility, there's fear and whispers. You hear one now carried on the wind from a marble-columned hall. Boethius is dead. Boethius, philosopher, senator, the guy who literally wrote The Consolation of Philosophy while awaiting execution in prison. And who had him executed? That's right, Theodoric. Why? Because Theodoric thought Boethius was plotting with the Eastern Roman Empire. Never mind that no hard evidence emerged. Never mind that Boethius was trying to defend another senator from false charges. Theodoric saw conspiracy where others saw loyalty. and Boethius he was given no trial. Just a dark cell, a slow death, and posthumous sainthood. You wonder if Theodoric even blinked. Historians still argue whether Theodoric was paranoid or just pragmatic. Maybe both. He was, after all, a Gothic king ruling Romans who barely tolerated him. He had to look strong, unyielding, which is hard to do when your subjects still think you're barbarian adjacent. Let's rewind a bit. Theodoric spent part of his youth in Constantinople as a hostage. Not in chains exactly, but very much a political bargaining chip. There he learned Latin Greek politics and how to wear a toga without tripping. He returned to the Ostrogoths with a head full of Roman ambition and a sword full of Gothic heritage. When Italy fell into chaos, he seized the chance and took it, cutting down Odoacer, the previous king, at a banquet. Yes, a banquet. Theodoric invited Odoacer to a feast to negotiate peace, then stabbed him to death. Legend says he sliced him from collarbone to hip, which, if nothing else, shows commitment. But don't be fooled into thinking Theodoric ruled with pure savagery. He actually did a lot of things right, repaired aqueducts, kept taxes reasonable, even kept bread flowing into cities. His reign is sometimes remembered as a golden twilight. Not quite empire, not quite collapse. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Theodoric was illiterate. Couldn't read, couldn't write. He ruled an empire the size of Spain with scribe's memory and sharp instincts. According to one account, he used to trace his signature with a stencil. The man basically pioneered the Gothic version of the rubber stamp. But here's where the cracks show. Theodoric was an Arian Christian, a sect considered heretical by Roman Catholics. Most of his Roman subjects viewed Arians with the same suspicion modern office workers reserve for people who microwave fish. It made unity challenging. That tension simmered until it boiled over into executions like Boethius's. And then there's Symmachus, Boethius's father-in-law, also a senator, also dead, executed shortly after his son-in-law. Theodoric never said why, just silence, the kind that fills basilicas long after the chants stop. Toward the end of his reign, Theodoric becomes increasingly withdrawn. The man who once galloped across the Danube now avoids public appearances. Some say he saw the ghost of Boethius in his dreams. Others claim he mistook a fish head at dinner for a human skull. Superstitions swirl. Fear is a poor sedative. When he finally dies, his successors barely hold things together. The fragile peace collapses. The Eastern Romans invade. The Goths lose ground, and Theodoric, his mausoleum, still stands in Ravenna, huge round cone, built of marble blocks so precisely placed that no mortar was needed. Just pressure, like his rule. You step away from the mausoleum and glance at the fading daylight. Was Theodoric a tyrant hiding behind good intentions, or a good ruler forced into bloodshed by paranoid politics? Maybe both. He's not the first king to kill in the name of stability. He won't be the last. Still, you can't quite shake the image, a crown, a dagger, and a philosophy book all sitting on the same desk. You're deep in the old lands now, beyond rivers, beyond law, beyond the reach of Roman scribes. The trees here lean in like they're listening, and the stories they whisper are older than ink. You feel it in your bones. This is the realm of Ermanaric, the Gothic king, whose name lingers like smoke. And not the friendly kind. You've probably never heard of Ermanaric in school. Most people haven't. His legend is more folklore than fact, more ash than architecture. But the stories that survive, oh, they're soaked in blood, betrayal, and a particular kind of vengeance that makes you glad you're not wearing a crown. He ruled the Ostrogoths sometime in the 4th century. Yes, we're drifting even deeper into the fog of the past. The Romans called him a king of immense power, and several sources claim he ruled a swath of Eastern Europe so large it made Caesar look like a weekend landlord. How much of that is true? Historians still argue whether Ermanoric's empire was a grand federation or just a really good PR campaign by later Gothic chroniclers. But here's the scandal that echoes loudest: the execution of Sunilda. Sunilda, or Svanhildr in the Norse retellings, was either Ermanoric's wife, mistress, or noblewoman from a rebellious clan, depending on who's telling the tale. But what all the versions agree on, she was accused of betrayal, and the punishment Ermanoric chose, having her torn apart by horses. Yes, horses. As in tied limb to limb and sent galloping in 4 directions, levels of overkill. The ancient chronicler Jordanes, writing centuries later, spins it with grim flair. Ermanoric was so furious over her betrayal that he ordered this brutal punishment to strike fear into the hearts of would-be traitors. Mission accomplished. You're pretty terrified just hearing about it. But was Sunilda really guilty? That depends on your source. Some say she was simply part of a marriage alliance gone sour. Others believe her family led a rebellion and she took the blame. Still others argue the entire story is symbolic, an old epic metaphor for the fragmentation of Gothic unity. Either way, the scandal stuck like dried blood, and her brothers, oh, they didn't take it well. In one retelling, they hunt Ermanoric down and stab him in the side with spears laced in poison. He doesn't die immediately, because of course he doesn't, but slowly, painfully. Long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Some later Gothic poets, especially in the Norse sagas, portray Ermanoric as a cruel old tyrant already falling apart when revenge found him. One version even claims he had a dozen war banners soaked in his enemy's blood. Fringe theory, maybe. But when your reputation is this dark, even fiction starts to feel plausible. Quirky fringe, tidbit incoming. In the Poetic Edda, a later Norse text, Ermanoric morphs into a kind of mythic archetype, a mix of real king and symbolic warning. His name becomes shorthand for betrayal, and his court a place where nothing ends well. One Icelandic version describes his castle as having more bones than bricks. Sleep tight. But let's zoom out for a moment. Ermanoric wasn't just a sadist with a thing for horse-drawn executions. He was part of a larger Gothic struggle to forge identity in the shadow of Rome. His kingdom may have been stitched together from tribal alliances, fragile diplomacy, and brute strength. The Sunilda story might not be a footnote, it could be the hinge point when that fragile unity shattered. See, after his death, the Ostrogoths split. The Huns come roaring in not long after. Ermanoric's so-called empire collapses like a poorly pitched tent. His successors are scattered, absorbed, or annihilated. In the long arc of history, his reign is a flicker. But flickers can burn. You crouch beside a long-forgotten barrow mound, his supposed grave. There's no plaque, no statue, just a sense that power used wrong doesn't leave legacies. It leaves warnings. One last twist. A few sources claim Ermanoric wasn't the monster the poets say, that his story was exaggerated by enemies or monks looking to villainize pagan kings, that the Sunilda tale was a Gothic Romeo and Juliet remix twisted into horror. But then again, no one writes love songs about being pulled apart by horses, so you stand up, dust off your cloak, and step away from the mossy grave. The wind stirs, the trees creak, and somewhere far off, a horse neighs. You decide to walk a little faster. You emerge from the mists of Gothic memory and step into the sultry, backstabby world of Merovingian Gaul, a kingdom ruled by long-haired kings, dagger-wielding queens, and political schemes thicker than the stew boiling in that smoky corner hut. And tonight, you're walking into the court of Queen Brunhilda. You're probably thinking, ah yes, Brunhilde, the medieval name that sounds like someone who brews potions in a mossy cottage. But no, Brunhilde doesn't deal in potions. She deals in assassination orders, forged decrees, and enough scandal to make modern tabloids look like hymnals. Originally a Visigothic princess from Spain, Brunhilde enters the Frankish world through marriage, an alliance meant to secure peace between squabbling kingdoms. She marries King Sigibert Thon of Austrasia, and for a moment it actually works. She's beautiful, sharp-tongued, politically savvy. She charms the court. The nobles are intrigued. The scribes sharpen their quills. But there's one small snag, Fredegund. Fredegund is the concubine of Chilperic Sigibert's half-brother and rival king of Neustria. If Brunhilde is the strategic chess queen, Fredegund is the wildcard joker with a tendency to stab pieces off the board when no one's looking. These two women despise each other immediately, and over the next 4 decades their feud will practically become a national sport. Now you're standing in Brunhilde's chambers, where royal letters are being penned with unsettling speed. One is a marriage contract. Another is a death warrant. Maybe both in the same scroll. Hard to say. After Sigibert is assassinated, almost certainly on Fredegund's orders, Brunhilde is imprisoned. But not for long. She bounces back into power like a political tennis ball. She remarries. She advises her sons, then her grandsons. She becomes the matriarch behind 3 generations of rulers, and with each coronation, she grows more ruthless. Historians still argue whether Brunhilde was a brilliant stateswoman or a dangerous manipulator. Probably both. Some chroniclers claim she was just trying to protect her family's legacy. Others accuse her of inciting wars, imprisoning bishops, and executing nobles without trial. Fun grandma energy. Her signature move, letters. She writes constantly, edicts, royal orders, alliances, threats, disguised as invitations. The bishops of Gaul once complained they were receiving too many royal missives from the woman and asked her to slow down. She didn't. Here's a mainstream fact: under Brunhilde's guidance, roads were repaired, taxes were standardized, and several cathedrals were constructed. Not bad for someone constantly accused of dabbling in witchcraft and regicide. But the scandals don't stop. Her children betray her. Her grandsons turn against each other. The Frankish nobles start to whisper that maybe power shouldn't be passed through strong women, and maybe this queen grandmother is inconvenient. Which brings us to her brutal finale. By the time Brunhilde is in her 70s, she's still holding court, still writing letters, still pulling strings. But her enemies have grown bolder. Clotaire II, son of Fredegund, remember her, finally captures Brunhilde after decades of dynastic warfare. He accuses her of causing the deaths of 10 kings, which might be a slight exaggeration, or not. Now comes the fringe tidbit you'll wish wasn't real. Brunhilde is sentenced to death in a manner that would have made Ermanaric nod in approval. According to some sources, she's tied to a wild horse and dragged to death. Others say it was 4 horses, just for symmetry. Either way, it's medieval efficiency at its most horrifying. The church is silent. The nobles cheer. And just like that, a 70-something former queen mother regent and possibly serial instigator is reduced to a smear in the dust. And yet, her legend endures. Not as a footnote, but as a symbol of dangerous intelligence. Later generations, especially in female-ruled courts, revisit Brunhilde's story with suspicion and admiration. A few even call her a proto-feminist icon. Centuries before, that was a phrase. As you walk away from the field where she fell, you glance back at the horizon. The air is heavy. Somewhere behind you, a scribe is already rewriting her story, smoothing the scandal, toning down the rage. But you were here. You saw the letters. You smelled the ink. You know better. You don't get far before the air shifts sharper now, with a scent of steel and something faintly herbal. Poison, possibly. Welcome to Fredegund's world. If Brunhilde was the queen with the ink-stained fingers and political cunning, Fredegund is what happens when raw ambition skips charm school and goes straight for the axe. You enter her court carefully, trying not to make eye contact with anyone carrying a tray. Fredegund has a reputation she doesn't forget and she doesn't forgive. And if she offers you a cup of wine, don't drink it. If she doesn't offer you a cup of wine, run. Born a servant, possibly even a slave. Fredegund didn't climb her way into power so much as she hacked her way in. She was the handmaid of Queen Audovera Chilperic Thurn's first wife, until she caught the king's eye. One royal glance later, Audovera was out, and Fredegund was in. Some sources say Audovera was exiled. Others say she was murdered. Coin toss. Fredegund wasted no time in clearing the path. Chilperic had sons with other women. They start dying mysteriously. An inconvenient bishop assassinated at the altar. A noble who complains about taxes falls from his horse onto his own sword. Twice. You're not even surprised when you learn that Fredegund kept her own private band of assassins. Like a medieval version of a security team, but with more poison rings and fewer performance reviews. She wasn't subtle, but subtlety's overrated when fear works just as well. Still, you're not here to watch her kill. You're here to watch her rule. And rule she does, especially after Chilperic's death, which wouldn't you know, it is also suspicious. He's stabbed to death in a hallway. The killer never found. The motive, take a guess. With her husband gone, and her infant son Clotaire II, the only surviving heir, Fredegund becomes regent. And now you're seeing her at her sharpest. Every day she signs decrees, bribes bishops, executes traitors, and plots revenge against her arch-rival Brunhilde. Think of it as long-distance hate mail, but with real armies. Here's the kicker. Despite all this bloodshed, the church never excommunicated her, not once. Why? Maybe because she made generous donations. Maybe because no one wanted to be the bishop that accidentally falls into a fireplace. Historians still argue whether Fredegund's violence was self-defense or pure bloodlust. Some describe her as a necessary evil, a woman in a man's world, forced to use the only weapons she had. Others call her a tyrant in pearls. Hard to say. The body count is persuasive either way. Want a quirky detail? A late source claims that Fredegund once had a rival noblewoman strangled with her own veil at a royal gathering. Whether it's true or embroidered for flair, it definitely sends a message about accessory safety. You follow her into the cathedral at Rouen, where she kneels in prayer. It's jarring, this woman who turned palaces into morgues, now whispering psalms like a weary nun. But look closer. Her eyes aren't tearful. They're calculating. She's not asking for forgiveness. She's reminding God she's still here. And here's the twist no one saw coming. Despite the bloodshed, despite the venom, despite every scandal in the book, Fredegund's son Clotaire II grows up to rule a united Frankish kingdom. He survives, consolidates power, and even outlives Brunhilde, whose brutal execution you remember too well. Was it luck? Was it strategy? Or was it the long shadow of a mother who'd removed every threat before he could walk? When Fredegund finally dies, likely of natural causes, the court breathes a little easier. But they don't relax for long. Her legend looms large. Her enemies are mostly dead, and her son is wearing a crown forged in flame and fury. As you walk away, you can't help but think, if Fredegund had been born into royalty instead of scrubbing its floors, would the chronicles read differently? Would she be called a saint, a stateswoman? Maybe. But history doesn't give sympathy to the sharp-edged. You leave her chamber slowly watching your back. With Fredegunda, it always pays, to be sure. You're back in Constantinople now, but the glitter feels colder this time. The marble walls echo with a strange tension, like the city itself is holding its breath. You step through the gates not to fanfare, but to the hush of suspicion. Because tonight, you're following the return of Justinian II, the emperor who lost everything including his nose and somehow came back for more. Yes, his nose. Let's talk about that. Justinian II, son of Constantine IV, first took the throne in 685 at just 16 years old. Bright, ambitious, and deeply pious, he initially tried to be everything an emperor was supposed to be. He reformed tax policies, struck peace deals, and minted coins with his face-standard imperial starter kit. But underneath it all was a temper that could melt lead. He trusted no one. He punished dissent swiftly, sometimes brutally. So it wasn't long before the cracks showed. By 695, the people had had enough. A rebellion led by his rival Leontios exploded into action. Justinian was captured, and brace yourself, his nose was sliced off. A symbolic mutilation meant to ensure he could never rule again. After all, who would follow a disfigured emperor? You'd think that'd be the end of the story. You'd be wrong. Justinian was exiled to Cherson in Crimea, humiliated, mutilated, and dethroned. And yet the man waited, plotted, survived. Think of it as medieval rage-quitting, except instead of logging off, he married a Khazar princess, gained allies in Central Asia, and eventually convinced a Bulgarian king to help him invade his own empire. In 705, a decade after his fall, Justinian stormed back into Constantinople under cover of night. He scaled the walls with a group of loyalists, snuck into the city, and claimed the throne. Again. The reaction: shock, horror, awkward applause. No one had expected the noseless emperor to return, let alone with a vengeance list. Because here's the thing, Justinian didn't come back to forgive and forget. He came back like a man possessed. Within months, he'd executed his old rivals, rounded up anyone who had even blinked during his exile, and resumed rule with the kind of paranoia you only earn through years of plotting in a Crimean backwater. Historians still argue whether Justinian's second reign was driven by justice, vengeance, or sheer trauma. He restructured the military, tightened alliances, and even held a major church council. But he also filled prisons, burned estates, and reinstated torture like it was a festival game. And his appearance, that mutilated face, became a kind of warped imperial brand. He didn't hide it. In fact, he minted coins showing his disfigured profile, nose, gone eyes sharp as ever. A message, perhaps, that said, "I'm back, and I'm done pretending to be pretty." Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Byzantine sources claim Justinian wore a golden nose prosthetic, a sort of imperial fashion statement, that clinked when he turned his head. Imagine it glinting in the council chamber as he stared down trembling generals. Whether it was decorative or functional, one thing's certain: it wasn't subtle. You move through his court like a whisper, watching as fear settles into the stones. Even his allies walk on eggshells. His wife Theodora of the Khazars seems calm and diplomatic, one of the few people who can talk him down from rage. But she knows too. She knows he's not the same man she married. Power does that. So does exile. And the ending predictable in a poetic kind of way. In 711, yet another rebellion brews, this time led by Philippicus Bardanes. The army turns against Justinian again. He tries to flee, carrying his young son with him. But he's captured, executed. His head is sent to the new usurper like a grim calling card. His son is hunted down and killed soon after. That second reign, it lasts barely 6 years. and yet you can't shake the feeling that Justinian II left more than blood behind. His story became a cautionary tale about ambition, revenge, and the strange way power sticks to some people, even when the world cuts them down. Some chroniclers called him mad, others called him chosen. One monk simply wrote he ruled as one marked by God's fury, which, depending on your translation, is either deeply respectful or deeply sarcastic. You step back through the city gates one last time. Behind you, the palace looms, windows dark, the scent of incense lingering like regret. You don't need a golden nose to smell the downfall coming. You travel upriver now, past quiet villages and hushed wheat fields, until you reach the Rhine. The waters churn a little faster here, not from storms, but from the weight of 1,000 legends. And there, perched on a craggy islet in the current, stands a squat stone tower. Gray, crooked, watching. They call it the Mäuseturm, the Mouse Tower. And if that doesn't raise an eyebrow, the story behind it will. You enter with caution. The stone is slick with centuries of rain, and the narrow stairwell smells like old parchment and regret. Here centuries ago lived Bishop Hatto II of Mainz, a man whose name is now entangled with one of the strangest, darkest tales of the early medieval world. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Historians still argue whether Bishop Hatto was even real. Some believe he's a composite figure, part real bishop, part local tyrant, part Gothic bedtime cautionary tale. But you didn't come here for historical footnotes. You came for scandal. And scandal loves a good fable. The story goes like this. It's the 10th century. A famine grips the land. Crops fail, granaries sit half empty, and peasants line the roads in desperation. Bishop Hatto, instead of opening his storehouses, allegedly hoards grain and mocks the hungry. When his people beg for bread, he sneers, "These beggars breed like mice. Let them starve." But that's not the worst part. Not yet. According to legend, Hatto lures hundreds of starving peasants into a barn under the false promise of food. Once they're inside, he locks the doors and sets the place on fire. The screams rise like smoke. Hatto watches from a distance, reportedly murmuring, "Now the mice are quiet." Charming, right? But the story isn't done with him. Days later, the bishop retires to his tower on the river, this tower thinking himself untouchable. But then the mice come. Thousands of them. They swim across the Rhine, forming a churning carpet of fur and claws. They scale the stone, chew through the doors, and swarm the bishop's chamber. And there, as the tale goes, they devour him alive, sparing neither bone nor beard. Some say they even squeaked in Latin. Fringe, yes, but unforgettable. Of course, the modern mind rebels. Could mice really swim across a river and climb a tower? Probably not. But then again, this isn't a lesson in biology. It's a morality tale. One that clings to the bones of Hatto's reputation like mice. Here's the mainstream historical fact. There was a Bishop Hatto II of Mainz in the 10th century. He was powerful, politically active, and a loyal supporter of Otto the Great. He helped shape imperial policy, restructured abbeys, and left behind a respectable legacy, at least on paper. But local folklore remembers him differently. Some think the legend of the Mouse Bishop was later projected onto him by angry peasants or rival clerics. Others believe the tower, likely used for customs enforcement, became the perfect stage for ghost stories once the real man was long buried. Still, something about the image sticks, a rich man watching the poor burn only to be consumed by the very creatures he mocked. It's almost too poetic not to believe even a little. And here's your quirky detail. In the early 1800s, when Romantic poets rediscovered this legend, they loved it. The tower was restored. Tourists came. Postcards were printed. A cautionary tale about cruelty became a riverside attraction. because nothing says vacation like historical karmic rodent justice. You peer out from the top of the tower. The river flows on indifferent. The villagers on the shore go about their business. No one here believes the mice will return. But they also don't store grain too long, just in case. You step out into the daylight, brushing phantom whiskers from your coat. Whatever the truth was, Bishop Haddo's legacy has been gnawed into something far larger than his own life. And like all good legends, it keeps nibbling at the edge of memory. The air turns warm and thick with sweet perfume as you follow the trail of laughter through the gardens of the Merovingian court. Peacocks strut between marble fountains, and lyres pluck half-hearted tunes in the distance. You're not in the war tents or shadowy crypts of our previous scandals tonight. No. You're deep in the palace of King Dagobert Duion, and things are about to get delightfully inappropriate. Dagobert. Even the name sounds like someone who should be leaning too close at a feast wine sloshing out of his goblet cloak, askew already working on his next secret affair. While later medieval writers liked to whitewash their monarchs into saintly figures, the scribes couldn't quite resist spilling a little ink on Dagobert's after-hours escapades. Technically, Dagobert was king of the Franks in the early 7th century, a descendant of Clovis, that warlord-turned-saint who Christianized France. Dagobert inherited a kingdom that spanned Gaul and part of modern-day Germany. He had gold, he had armies, and he had a crown shaped like the apocalypse. So what did he do with it? He partied. A lot. Even before his full coronation, he was already acquiring lovers like some people collect shoes. One of his early flings, Ragnatrude, bore him a son, Clovis II. She was not a queen, just one of many noble women, and maybe a few not so noble who passed through his gilded chambers like exotic birds in spring. And while he eventually married Nantilde, a perfectly respectable noblewoman, who bore him heirs and carried the dignity of the throne. Let's just say Dagobert didn't cancel his Thursday evening villa entertainment subscription. Nantilde, to her credit, put up with it, or ignored it. Hard to say with Merovingian queens, they had the patience of saints and the political instincts of gladiators. Historians still argue whether Dagobert was a scandalous philanderer or simply following the robust traditions of Merovingian kings. One cleric claimed the royal bedchambers were as busy as the palace kitchens, which raises a lot of questions about both. But he wasn't just about silk sheets and suspicious pregnancies. Dagobert had a political brain buried under the bedsheets. He centralized administration, reformed coinage, and moved the capital to Paris. Yes, that Paris, planting the roots of its future prominence. And brace for it, he built the Basilica of Saint-Denis. That's right. The guy who was known for sneaking out of Mass to flirt with choristers also commissioned one of the most sacred churches in French history. Future kings would be buried there. It's a paradox so sharp you could slice your confessional robe on it. Here's your quirky tidbit. One legend claims Dagobert had a secret underground tunnel from his chamber to a nearby convent. Not for piety. For convenience, the tale goes that he would slip out through a trap door hidden behind a tapestry, spend the night in prayer, and return just before dawn. Monks, of course, never mentioned it, but they did write a suspicious number of hymns about midnight blessings. His popularity among the people was surprisingly high. Despite, or maybe because of his wild lifestyle, he was viewed as generous, jovial, and weirdly relatable. He handed out land grants, celebrated festivals with flair, and never turned down a good feast. Even after his death, Dagobert couldn't quite escape scandal. There's a medieval satirical poem called Le Voyage de Charlemagne à Jérusalem et à Constantinople, in which Charlemagne visits the Eastern Emperor and brags that he's a better lover than Dagobert ever was. Yes, Charlemagne. The man with 12 kids and a battlefield resume longer than a cathedral aisle still felt insecure about Dagobert's romantic reputation. Now that is legacy. And the church. Oh, they tried to tidy things up. Later centuries invented a story that Saint Denis himself came to guide Dagobert's soul after death, pulling him from the clutches of demons. Yes, literal demons. The story says angels arrived just in time to keep him out of hell, which sounds more like divine PR than theology. But hey, the basilica did need a founding miracle. You wander back through the gardens where the torches burn low and laughter still echoes faintly. Somewhere in the branches above, a nightingale sings, unaware of the scandalous diplomacy happening under its perch. And you're left to wonder whether Dagobert was a king who couldn't resist temptation, or a man who understood that in a crumbling world, joy, however messy, is its own kind of resistance. Just maybe skip the convent tunnel. You step out of the palace gardens and onto a long, dusty road, one that winds not through forests or cities, but through centuries of uncertain memory. This path leads you east to Alexandria. Not the bustling port city it once was, but still glimmering in its faded grandeur, heavy with incense and argument. The Mediterranean laps gently at the shore, but something sharper stirs in the wind tonight mystery. You've arrived at the story of Catherine of Alexandria, or maybe the idea of her. Because here's the strange truth: the more people revere her, the less we know if she ever truly existed. But don't let that stop you. Legends don't need passports. According to tradition, Catherine was a noblewoman in the 4th century, educated, eloquent, and devoutly Christian, in a time when that got you arrested more often than applauded. She was said to have converted dozens, even hundreds of pagan philosophers in a single debate. You imagine her stepping into a torchlit hall, silk robe, swirling jaw sharper than a double-edged blade. She makes a solid first impression. The Roman emperor at the time, usually identified as Maxentius, hears about her defiance and in true insecure despot fashion summons her. He tries reason. She responds with logic. He sends philosophers. She crushes them in open debate. He then proposes marriage because naturally nothing says "I admire your convictions" like "let's get married" or "die trying." She declines. Politely, probably with a smirk. And so he does what any rejected tyrant might: he throws her in prison. Here's where things get spectacular. In her cell, she converts the guards, converts the empress, converts passing rats, probably. She becomes less a prisoner and more a one-woman revival tour. Frustrated, Maxentius orders her execution on a breaking wheel, a torture device designed to slowly shatter the body. But as legend has it, the moment she touches the wheel, it shatters. Wood flies. Nails ping into walls. A divine mic drop. So he beheads her instead. Now here's your mainstream fact: Catherine's cult became one of the most popular in medieval Europe. Crusaders prayed to her. Scholars claimed her as a patron. Joan of Arc said Catherine spoke to her in visions. Her feast day, November 25th, was marked by processions, fasting, and awkwardly staged martyrdom plays across Europe. But, and it's a big but, historians still argue whether Catherine of Alexandria was ever real. Some think her story was inspired by Hypatia, the famed pagan philosopher, who was murdered in Alexandria, but a century later, and under very different circumstances. Others suspect Catherine was created whole cloth, a pious Frankenstein sewn from pieces of older martyr stories, a bit of Sophia, a touch of Damaris, and a sprinkle of narrative convenience. Still, her story stuck. Why? Maybe because it gave medieval women, especially noble women, an intellectual heroine. Someone who didn't win with swords or seduction, but with ideas and dignity. And okay, yes, some miraculous wheel-smashing flair. Here's your fringe tidbit: for centuries, monks claimed her body was discovered atop Mount Sinai, transported there by angels, of course. The monastery of St. Catherine still stands today, nestled into the arid cliffs, guarding what they insist are her relics. Pilgrims weep before the bones. Skeptics raise eyebrows. But no one leaves unmoved. You walk the halls of the monastery in your mind. The air smells of old incense and fresher doubt. Paintings of Catherine line the walls, always poised, always haloed, always surrounded by symbols: the wheel, the sword, the crown, the palm. Was she real? Maybe not. But she is. She's in the stained glass of French cathedrals, in the whispered prayers of desperate scholars before exams, in the dreams of mystics, and the pages of 1,000 books. You sit beneath a cypress tree and imagine Catherine facing down an emperor with the quiet confidence of someone who knows truth cuts deeper than steel. Whether that woman ever walked the earth is less important than the fact that tonight she walks through your imagination like a queen. And unlike most of the rulers we've met, this one leaves behind no bloodshed, no poisoned wine, no assassins in the shadows. Just the soft echo of words spoken clearly even to the end. You blink and the quiet cypress grove is gone. In its place, blinding sunlight glints off golden altars, peacock feathers shimmer in the breeze, and everywhere, the scent of frankincense and rosewater. You're in Rome, technically, but not your grandmother's Rome. This is the court of Elagabalus, high priest of the sun god, an accidental emperor of one of the world's most powerful empires. It's going to get weird fast. Elagabalus was born around 204 CE in the Syrian city of Emesa. A child of the sun, literally, he served as the high priest of the local deity Elagabal, a black conical meteorite worshipped as a god. Yes, you read that right. Through a series of palace intrigues, family power grabs, and an extremely persuasive grandmother named Julia Maesa, he was elevated to Roman emperor at the age of 14. 14. That's barely old enough to drive a chariot. Now picture that boy still in priestly robes paraded into the Roman Senate wearing makeup, calling himself the earthly spouse of a god, and insisting that his god replace Jupiter at the top of the imperial pantheon. Cue the scandalous gasps. The Roman elite were not amused. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was full-on sacrilege with a side of performance art. Elagabalus dragged the sacred stone of Elagabal all the way from Syria to Rome and built it its own temple. Then he declared himself married to it. And if that's not enough for you, he also staged lavish ceremonies where he wedded various other gods, often in scenes involving elaborate choreography, incense doves, and reportedly a fair amount of nudity. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was simply an enthusiastic teen caught in a cultural clash, or something more subversive, a ruler trying to fuse East and West through extreme pageantry, or perhaps a holy man turned emperor whose spiritual theater was too much for Rome's rigid backbone to handle. But religion was just the beginning. Let's talk about Elagabalus's personal life. Caution, mild chaos ahead. He married at least 5 women during his short reign, including a Vestal virgin, an enormous scandal since breaking a Vestal's vow of chastity was considered sacrilege punishable by death. He also married men, or claimed he did. Ancient sources are deliciously vague, possibly confused, and definitely judgmental. The Historia Augusta claims Elagabalus offered large sums of money to any physician who could perform a sex change operation, a procedure that did not, shall we say, exist in the form he imagined. Some modern scholars suggest Elagabalus may be the earliest recorded historical figure with a transgender identity, or at least with openly gender non-conforming behavior. Others debate whether this is a reflection of the emperor's own identity, or just Roman writers indulging in character assassination via ancient tabloid-style slander. Either way, the emperor asked to be referred to with feminine titles in some records. He was known to wear women's clothing, wigs, and makeup in public. He also preferred to be called Empress by his close companions. Quirky tidbit: one Roman historian, Cassius Dio, claims that Elagabalus would often disguise himself and sneak into taverns and brothels not as a customer, but as a servant. Not to seduce, but to serve. Pour wine, clean tables, observe. Either a lesson in humility or a very niche kink. Possibly both. And the palace. Oh, it was a fever dream. Pet lions were kept on leashes. Guests were seated on air-filled cushions that collapsed mid-dinner. Elagabalus once allegedly served food entirely made of wax just to see who would pretend to enjoy it. Other times he'd release rose petals from the ceiling in such massive quantities that one guest reportedly suffocated beneath them. An emperor turned prankster, or prophet, or unstable teen. You decide. But behind the silk curtains and rose petals, Rome was growing anxious. The army grumbled. The Senate plotted. Even his family, yes, including the grandmother who'd placed him on the throne, started whispering about damage control. So in 292 CE, after just 4 years of rule, Elagabalus was assassinated. His own guards dragged him through the palace halls, killed him, and tossed his body into the Tiber River. His mother, loyal to the end, was murdered alongside him. The next emperor was his cousin, Alexander Severus, whom Roman historians described as dignified, serious, and extremely boring, which you suspect was exactly the point. And Elagabalus, officially, his reign was condemned. His statues were destroyed. His name was cursed in the annals. But unofficially, he lived on. As scandal, as symbol, as a glittering outlier in an empire built on order. Today, Elagabalus fascinates scholars, artists, and even gender historians. Was he unstable? Was he misunderstood? Was he ahead of his time, or just a teenager with a god complex and a dangerously unlimited wardrobe? You leave his court under a heavy moon, rose petals stuck to your sleeves. Somewhere behind you, a flute trills. Someone laughs. And the scent of myrrh lingers just long enough to make you wonder if maybe Rome was never ready for a ruler quite like this. You step out of the perfumed chaos of Rome and into something far colder. The landscape has changed again. This time it's raw and grim, thick with northern fog. The air smells of iron, sweat, and old blood. You're standing in the hall of a Lombard king watching a feast unfold. But this isn't just a dinner party. It's the kind of gathering that ends in legend. Meet Alboin, king of the Lombards. A warlord with a crown, a laugh like a thunderclap, and a taste for vengeance that borders on theatrical. The room is warm with firelight and ale-soaked cheer. Meat sizzles, goblets clink. But at the head of the table, Alboin raises a curious object, a drinking cup. Ornate. Polished bone. And here's the twist: it used to be a human skull. More specifically, the skull of Cunimund, the defeated king of the Gepids. And even more specifically, his wife's father. Let that sink in. You're watching as Alboin, conqueror of the Gepids, lifts the hollowed skull of his slain father-in-law and offers it with a grin to his new wife Rosamund. "Drink," he says, "from your father's head." You suddenly remember you've lost your appetite. Rosamund, to her credit, does not swoon. She takes the goblet, she drinks, and she begins to plot. This scandal, preserved in vivid horror by Paul the Deacon and other early medieval sources, is one of the most infamous moments in Lombard history. Historians still argue whether it happened exactly as described. Skull goblets are more common in epic poetry than archaeology, but the core truth remains: Alboin humiliated his wife in the worst way imaginable, and she did not forget. But let's rewind a bit. because Alboin didn't just appear in a banquet hall with a bone mug. He came from a line of Lombard warriors who moved like a storm across Europe. Under his command, they migrated into northern Italy, exploiting the chaos left behind by the collapsing Ostrogothic kingdom. Alboin didn't just defeat the Gepids he crushed, them took their land and sealed the deal by marrying Rosamund as part of the spoils. Sounds romantic, right? Except that whole married the daughter of the man you beheaded thing tends to leave a lasting chill in the honeymoon suite. And Alboin wasn't exactly subtle. The Skull Cup incident wasn't just a sick joke, it was a message. To his court, to his enemies, maybe even to Rosamund herself. He was the kind of man who didn't conquer just cities, he conquered memory. Here's your quirky detail: skull cups, while shocking today, weren't entirely unheard of in warrior cultures. The Scythians and even some Norse tribes practiced similar rituals, drinking from the heads of defeated enemies as a sign of dominance. But to serve it at a royal banquet to your own wife, that's bold and suicidal, because not long after Rosamund strikes back, she begins a quiet alliance with one of Alboin's closest men, a palace guard named Helmichis. Was it love, necessity, revenge? Possibly all three. Together they hatch a plan. According to one version, they drug Alboin's wine. According to another, Rosamund tied his sword to the bedpost so he couldn't defend himself. Either way, he wakes to murder in the dark. Alboin is killed in his chambers, likely in 572 CE. And just like that, the man who drank from a skull dies in silence by a lover's hand. But the scandal doesn't end there. Rosamund and Helmichis flee to Ravenna seeking protection from the Eastern Romans. She tries to seduce a general to gain power. Helmichis finds out. She poisons him. He realizes what's happening and forces her to drink too. The scene collapses into a deadly toast. Everyone dies. Historians still argue how much of this was real and how much was retroactive Gothic drama. The timeline is murky, the sources biased. But one thing is clear: Alboin's legacy wasn't his kingdom, it was this story. A tale of brutality, humiliation, and a revenge so theatrical it deserves its own candlelit opera. You walk away from the banquet hall, the fire now low and the skull cup empty. There's silence where the laughter used to be. Not because the court has forgotten Alboin, but because they can't. His rule was brief, his conquest brutal, but his ending pure, unforgettable scandal. Some kings rule by law, others by sword. Alboin, he ruled by spectacle. And in the Dark Ages, spectacle has a very long shelf life. You wipe the bone dust of Alboin's feast from your hands and step carefully into a different kind of trap, the soft, perfumed kind. Gone are the skull goblets and howling warriors. Now you're surrounded by velvet tapestries, whispered rumors, and papal side-eyes. Welcome to the scandal-drenched court of King Lotharis II of Lotharingia, where marital drama reaches levels not even daytime soap operas dare attempt. It's the mid-9th century. Lothair II, grandson of Charlemagne, sits uneasily on a throne carved from legal ambiguity. His kingdom, Lotharingia, is a slice of empire squeezed between modern-day France and Germany, full of nobles, nuns, and competing bishops. It's also full of the problem. And that problem is named Theutberga. You meet her in the palace chapel, pale and dignified. She's Lothair's legal wife, married for political alliance, not passion. Unfortunately for her, the king already has someone else warming his bed, his longtime mistress, Waldrada. Now, plenty of medieval kings had mistresses. That's not the scandal. The scandal is that Lothair wanted to divorce his wife and marry his mistress. And not quietly either. He pushes for it with the subtlety of a bull in a reliquary shop. But medieval Europe takes marriage seriously. like your immortal soul depends on it seriously. Divorce. You needed a very good reason. Infidelity, infertility, witchcraft, maybe demon possession, things you couldn't just pencil in. So Lothair accuses Theodberga of the worst crime imaginable, incest. Yes, he claims she had relations with her brother before their marriage. You blink thinking this has to be fabricated, and you're right. Even the medieval chroniclers smell something fishy. But Lothair pushes the claim hard. His bishops nod obediently. The court murmurs. Theodberga, backed into a corner, demands a trial by ordeal. You follow her to the riverbank, heart in your throat. A trial by ordeal isn't just a gamble, it's a prayer with bruises. In her case, it's an ordeal of hot iron or boiling water depending on the source. She passes, which in theory means God has spoken, she's innocent. Does Lothair accept this? Absolutely not. He tries again, and again. He petitions the Pope, then another, then a third. Each time he presents manipulated documents, coerced confessions, or the convenient interpretations of sympathetic clergy. Historians still argue whether the church was complicit, confused, or simply exhausted by this royal soap opera. Eventually, Pope Nicholas III steps in. He declares the divorce invalid, flat out. Lothair is ordered to return to Theodberga. The king is furious. He stalls, delays, then finally takes Theodberga back reluctantly, dramatically, and only after being threatened with excommunication. Here's your quirky tidbit: Lothair once tried to bribe Pope Nicholas with jewels and falcons, because apparently in 9th century diplomacy, nothing says "please approve my adultery" like sparkly bribes and birds of prey. The Pope, to his credit, was not amused. The real heartbreak: Theodberga never wanted any of this. She didn't ask to be queen's scapegoat or martyr. In some letters, she comes across as weary but shrewd, aware that her virtue is being weaponized by both sides. After the ordeal, she retires to a nunnery, vanishing quietly from court, her dignity scraped but intact. And Waldrada, she keeps a grip on Lothair's heart and possibly his household even after the marriage is officially null. She bears him several children, one of whom tries to claim the throne, later sparking even more legitimacy battles just for old scandal's sake. As for Lothair, he dies young, possibly from malaria or divine frustration. His kingdom is carved up among rivals. His name, once hopeful and heavy with Carolingian promise, is now mostly remembered for marital chaos and papal drama. Here's the legacy: this affair marks a turning point in European political theology. The Church asserts its right to decide royal marriages, a precedent that echoes all the way to Henry VIII centuries later. Because if even a king can't leave his wife without Rome's blessing, then no crown is safe from the altar's grip. You step away from Lothair's faded court, the velvet now moth-eaten, the whispers gone hoarse. But the scent of scandal lingers, rich and bitter. And somewhere, Theodberga's quiet prayers echo down a cloister corridor, still unanswered. The corridor's narrow now. Gone are the throne rooms and banquet halls. You walk instead through candle-lit passages, walls lined not with tapestries but whispers. You've entered the Byzantine palace, yes, but not the emperor's wing. You're headed somewhere stranger, quieter, and in its own way, far more dangerous. This is the domain of the eunuchs, and in Byzantium that word doesn't mean what you think it means. These weren't minor officials or cloistered servants. These were power brokers, kingmakers, puppet masters in silk slippers. Welcome to the backstage of imperial scandal, where the men who could never be emperors sometimes ruled them anyway. You brush past a heavy curtain. Behind it, two men in pale robes whisper over a map of the empire. Their heads are close. Their fingers trace borders. One is named Joseph Bringas Chamberlain, to Emperor Romanos III, the other unknown to history. That's how they liked it. Eunuchs in the Byzantine court weren't just tolerated, they were trusted. Why? Because they couldn't produce heirs. That made them, in theory, loyal, incapable of founding their own dynasties. They were seen as politically safe. You chuckle because you already know better. Take Starakios, for example, chief eunuch and power behind the throne of Emperor Irene. He didn't just advise, he commanded. He negotiated treaties, planned assassinations, and once allegedly kept the emperor from leaving the palace for 2 full years. And yes, he may have helped blind one of Irene's rivals. Eunuch doesn't mean soft. Or Narcissus, a famed eunuch general who led armies in Italy and reconquered much of the old Roman West. One bishop sneered that he had no beard, but the heart of a lion, which is old-timey shade for this guy terrifies me. By the 9th and 10th centuries, eunuchs filled nearly every major position: chamberlain, admiral, treasurer, even patriarch. Some historians still argue whether the Byzantine bureaucracy was genuinely meritocratic, or whether the emperors simply preferred their courtiers to be non-threatening in specific ways. But not every eunuch played nice. Let's talk about Basil Lekapanos, a eunuch who rose from illegitimate royal birth to imperial chief of staff. Basil served 6 emperors, outlasted most. He orchestrated military campaigns, manipulated tax policy, and according to some chroniclers, once replaced an emperor's mistress with one of his own choosing. That's bold. At one point, Basil grew so powerful that foreign ambassadors would bypass the emperor altogether and bring their gifts straight to him. Imagine being the emperor sitting on a golden throne and knowing your chamberlain is getting better birthday presents. Still, the emperors needed them. These eunuchs were brilliant administrators. They understood politics in a way most generals never could. They kept the gears turning even as emperors came and went like candle flames in a breeze. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit. There are records of eunuchs using coded fans during court ceremonies to signal messages to allies. A flick to the left, vote against the treaty. A downward wave, assassinate the governor. The imperial court was basically one long performance, and these guys had front row seats and the cue cards. But their rise didn't go unchallenged. Tensions grew. Emperors tried to limit eunuch influence. One even attempted to bar them from becoming patriarchs. That didn't last. The system always found a way to restore them. Because in Byzantium, influence wasn't about titles, it was about proximity. And the eunuchs, they were always close. You walk past their quarters now. Modest rooms in theory, but each one hides 1,000 favors, 1,000 secrets. Some held confession scrolls. Others kept lists of bribes and debts. A few had underground escape tunnels just in case an emperor got ideas. Historians still debate how much actual power these eunuchs held. Some claim they were puppets manipulated by the empresses or generals. Others argue they were the ones pulling the strings. The truth, as always, is complicated. But one thing is certain: no scandal in Byzantium was ever just about the man on the throne. It was also about the man behind the curtain, quiet, calculating, and sharper than any sword. You exit the palace wing slowly, the scent of ambergris and old ink trailing behind. Somewhere down the corridor, you hear laughter, soft, high-practiced. You don't know whose game it is tonight, but you know exactly who's keeping score. Word count 1, 293. Awaiting continue, Ban John Noi, continue, Chat GPT John Noi, Section 16. The laughter fades, replaced by something heavier. Harsher, hooves echo on frozen ground as you step into the world of Charles the Bald, a name that sounds like a medieval insult, and frankly, wasn't far off. You're now in West Francia in the 9th century, at the tail end of Charlemagne's dream. The once mighty empire has fractured into quarrelsome chunks. The Carolingians are scrambling for land crowns and control, and Charles, grandson of the great emperor, is one of the most ambitious claimants. Except no one wants him. Let's back up. Charles was the son of Louis the Pious and his second wife, Judith. The problem: Louis had sons from his first marriage. Older sons. Powerful sons. And when Louis tried to carve out a kingdom for Charles, the older brothers, Lothair, Louis the German, and Pippin, declared war. Yes, war. Over a baby. Charles was still in diapers when he became the reason for a continent-wide civil war. That's talent. The resulting conflict, often called the Carolingian Civil War, raged for decades. Charles grew up not with toys and tutors, but in military camps and whispered betrayals. By the time he was old enough to rule, he was already hardened and paranoid. You arrive just as Charles, now king of West Francia, is consolidating power. He's learned from his father's mistakes. No idealism here, just cold, calculated moves. He bribes nobles, marries into power, and spends more time fighting his own family than any foreign enemy. The church, ever opportunistic, tries to play kingmaker. Charles flatters, the Pope makes generous donations, and here's your mainstream fact: was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 875, reviving the imperial title after his brother Lothair's line fizzled out. Sounds impressive. Except, most people still called him Charles the Bald. Not Charles the Great, not Charles the Wise, just the Bald. And here's the thing, he wasn't even bald. That nickname, pure political trolling by his enemies. The medieval version of a smear campaign. If he had Twitter, it'd be crawl, not my emperor. Now, Charles's scandal isn't one single event. It's his entire style of ruling. He taxed like a madman, requisitioned food from churches, seized monastic land. At one point, he even stripped gold from church altars to pay off Viking raiders. Yes, Vikings. They were raiding Paris while he was emperor. Instead of fighting them, Charles paid them to leave a strategy that historians still argue over. Some say it was practical. Others call it cowardice in a crown. Quirky detail: Charles once tried to build an elite cavalry unit made entirely of monks. That's right, monk knights. Picture bald-headed scribes in full armor wielding lances between prayers. It didn't work. Monks preferred chanting to jousting. But the attempt, iconic. Now you enter the royal chapel during one of his infamous councils. Nobles are bickering, bishops are posturing. Charles sits quietly, absorbing it all. Then, without warning, he dismisses half the room. Not with a shout, just a nod, a gesture. The message is clear: you're either useful or replaceable. He rules with the caution of a man who knows his crown is slippery, and it is his sons rebel constantly. His vassals switch loyalties like shoes. His daughters are married off strategically, but even those alliances unravel. No matter how many titles Charles accumulates, his reign feels like one long chess match against fate itself, and the pièce de résistance, his death. In 877, Charles sets off to campaign in Italy again, but en route he becomes ill, fevered, delirious. He dies not in a grand palace or battlefield tent, but in a peasant's hut in the Alps, alone, undignified, and probably still fully clothed in imperial regalia because image mattered that much. The empire passes on, fragmented. The Carolingian name begins its long, uneven descent, but Charles leaves behind a strange legacy. Not feared like Charlemagne, not mocked like his father, but studied. He understood the new game: diplomacy, church politics, inheritance law. He kept the empire breathing barely through cleverness, not conquest. You walk through his abandoned court now, The tapestries still shimmer. The scrolls are still warm. And somewhere a monk mutters under his breath about taxes. Charles the Bald. The emperor who wasn't bald, but was surrounded by sharp knives and velvet gloves. You leave behind the crumbling bureaucracy of Charles's West Francia and descend into shadows deeper still into the flickering torchlight of medieval Venice. But don't expect gondolas or serenades tonight. You're walking straight into a web of political intrigue, so tangled, so venomous, it makes the rest of Europe look like a kindergarten sandbox. The year is 928, and the man at the center of tonight's scandal wears a title you may not expect to appear on this list: Pope John XXII. Yes, the Pope. Because if you thought the papacy in the Dark Ages was a beacon of unshakable holiness, well, brace yourself. This guy rewrote the job description with wine stains and lipstick. You find him not in prayer, but in bed. Mid-afternoon, curtains drawn, a courtesan slipping out the side door. He stretches, yawns, and waves off an anxious cardinal. There's a political crisis brewing. He couldn't care less. Born Octavianus, son of Alberic II of Spoleto, a powerful Roman noble who basically ran the city like a mafia, Don John was appointed pope at the tender age of 18. Think about that. Not old enough to rent a chariot without a co-signer, but somehow entrusted with the spiritual leadership of millions. He took the name John XXIII and promptly treated the Holy See like his personal nightclub. His papacy is legendary, not for doctrine or diplomacy, but for debauchery. According to contemporaries and Trust, they were not fans. John turned the Lateran Palace into a brothel, literally. One chronicler accused him of hosting gambling parties, ordaining boys as bishops for fun, and invoking pagan gods during dice games. Yes, pagan gods. In the Pope's palace. It's like walking into the Vatican and finding someone sacrificing a goat on the altar while chanting in Greek. Historians still argue how much of this is exaggerated. Many of the surviving accounts come from political enemies, especially the pro-Ottonian chroniclers who wanted him gone. But even adjusting for bias, the smoke from this scandal is too thick to ignore. John's biggest political mistake, ticking off Otto Wampherin's, the Holy Roman Emperor. At first, things were cordial. John crowned Otto in Rome in 962, officially reviving the empire under German leadership. But then John, perhaps bored or high on incense fumes, started secretly negotiating with Otto's rivals. When Otto found out, he returned to Rome with an army and called a synod, a kind of medieval HR tribunal, but with more swords. At the synod, a laundry list of John's crimes was aired out like musty vestments: simony, adultery, perjury, murder. They accused him of sleeping with his niece, blinding a cardinal, and toasting to the devil. Honestly, it reads like the world's worst Yelp review for a pope. And here's your quirky tidbit: the synod even claimed that John chewed communion bread while toasting Bacchus, which in theological terms is like mixing holy water with tequila. Probably not canonically approved. They deposed him, sort of. But John, ever resourceful, fled Rome, rallied some allies, and marched back. Once Otto left the city, John returned and undeposed himself. He punished those who had voted against him with an elegant sense of irony by mutilating and executing them. A pope turned petty warlord, wielding a cross in one hand and a sword in the other, but it wouldn't last. In 964, just a year or so after reclaiming his throne, John thought he died, suddenly, suspiciously. Some say he had a stroke. Others say he was murdered in bed by the husband of a woman he was sleeping with. Death by scandal, literally. Either way, the church didn't bother with canonization. His tomb was quietly tucked away, and his memory was buried deeper than the bones. And yet, he left a mark. His papacy is often cited as the low point of the saculum obscurum, the dark age of the papacy. a time when popes were installed by Roman nobles removed by imperial decree and more likely to host orgies than theological debates. You sit for a moment in the Lateran courtyard. The wind rustles through ancient vines brushing against cracked statues of saints. Somewhere beneath your feet, the footsteps of John the XIII still echo, slippered, hurried, occasionally drunk. Was he a corrupt youth in over his head, a pawn of his family? A libertine who never grasped the gravity of his role, historians still debate. But you already know, in the theater of scandal, few actors ever got such a holy stage and lit it so thoroughly on fire. You leave the marble shadows of the Lateran behind, the scent of scandal still clinging to your sleeves, and ride northward into colder lands where pine forests whisper secrets older than empires. Tonight, you're headed into the mist-draped kingdom of the Danes, specifically, to a king so ruthless, so volatile, that even Viking sagas describe him with a kind of nervous reverence. Say hello carefully to King Harald Bluetooth's father, the delightfully terrifying Gorm the Old. Now, Gorm doesn't get the same PR as his famous son, the one with a runestone and a wireless technology named after him. But Gorm was the kind of ruler who made ravens nervous. His reign is soaked in bloodstone and ice. And the scandal, oh, it's about faith, specifically when not to have it. Let's set the stage. It's the early 10th century. Denmark is still largely pagan, worshipping Thor, Odin, and the usual hammer-swinging crowd. But Christianity is creeping in, carried by monks, missionaries, and occasionally the swords of foreign kings. Some rulers bend, some convert. Gorm, he digs in his heels. Gorm the Old rules from gelling a fortress carved out of stone and stubbornness. He's got a fierce wife, Thyra, nicknamed Denmark's Pride, and a favorite son, Canute, who, spoiler alert, is not the one who survives to take the crown. The boy is bright, brave, and beloved, and he converts. That's where things start to heat up. According to some accounts, Gorm's son is secretly baptized while abroad, possibly during a visit to the German court. When word reaches Gorm, the king explodes. He reportedly flies into a rage so intense that the court records it as a weather event. The priests flee. The statues of Thor get polished. And Canute mysteriously disappears from the story. Here's your mainstream fact. When Gorm eventually dies, his surviving son, Harald Bluetooth, does convert to Christianity and even erects a runestone at Jelling that credits himself for making the Danes Christian. But guess what? He also does. He buries Gorm in a pagan mound in full traditional gear rather than a Christian grave. Why? Because even in death, Gorm didn't want a cross near him. Historians still argue whether this was political pragmatism, family drama, or sheer religious conviction. Was Gorm anti-Christian, or simply defending old customs in a time of cultural erosion? Either way, the message was clear: my gods, my rules. And now for your fringe tidbit, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that Harald moved Gorm's bones not once but twice. The first time from an older burial mound into a wooden church at Jelling. The second time possibly to somewhere else entirely. No one knows for sure. It's as if Gorm's ghost refused to rest under a Christian roof. Or perhaps Harald was just trying to appease everyone, God above and Dad below. You walk among the Jelling stones now. They stand like frozen thunderclaps in the earth. One side praises Christ, the other pure Norse mythos, dragons, serpents, symbols carved deep enough to outlast frost and flame. It's the architectural version of "Please don't haunt me, Father." But the scandal isn't just about Gorm's stubbornness. It's what it represents. This was the last gasp of Viking paganism in royal form, a final refusal to bow before the cross. Gorm knew the tide was turning. And rather than wade into it, he planted his feet and dared the sea to come. His wife Thyra, by contrast, was possibly Christian herself. She built fortifications, defended borders, whispered counsel. Some say she was the real power behind Gorm's throne. Others suggest Harold inherited her pragmatism and Gorm's fury and spent his reign trying to reconcile the two. In the end, you can't help but feel a little sympathy for Gorm. He wasn't a schemer or a seducer. He was a hammer in a world turning into parchment. A king who lived and died by his gods, even when that meant burying his son's future along with his own. As you leave Jelling, the mist rises thick and cold. Somewhere behind you, the runestones gleam faintly in the moonlight, half Viking, half Christian, all contradiction. And beneath the ground, Gorm the Old waits. Unconverted, unbothered, unforgettable. You wake beneath a tangled canopy of olive trees, cicadas humming like the ticking of ancient secrets. Dust clings to your boots as you climb a rocky hill to one of the strangest and most chaotic courts of the entire Dark Ages. Welcome to Byzantine Sicily, 11th century edition, where the ruling elite are half-cult, half-crime syndicate, and the crown sits on the brow of a man historians can barely agree even deserved the title of Duke. Say hello to Count Simon of Sicily, born into the infamous Hauteville clan, a family of Norman adventurers who crashed into southern Italy like caffeinated Vikings in chainmail. Simon's rule is short, strange, and soaked in scandal, but the juiciest bits, they swirl around his mother. That would be Adelaide del Vasto, a woman whose name should be whispered at court and embroidered on warning flags. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You find young Simon at around age 12 newly installed as Count of Sicily after the sudden death of his father Roger the Farthern. In theory, this makes Simon one of the most powerful children in Europe. In practice, the real power sits behind the curtain and wears a veil. Adelaide, his mother, rules as regent, and she rules hard. She keeps the court in Palermo on a tight leash, negotiates with popes, fends off Arab rebellions in the countryside, and arranges Simon's affairs, including the scandalous ones. And that's saying something, because Simon, despite being little more than a teen, already has a reputation for extravagance and excess. According to some chroniclers, he surrounds himself with entertainers, foreign mercenaries, and at least one pet leopard he attempts to dress in ceremonial robes for a palace feast. That's your fringe detail. The leopard reportedly ate a courtier's wig. No one laughed. But the biggest scandal, the line between Simon and his mother, starts to blur. Not romantically, don't worry, that's not where this is headed. But politically, Adelaide begins to act more and more like she's the sovereign. She signs documents without his name. She leads diplomatic missions solo. And most notably, she begins vetting his potential brides as if they're threats to her throne. Historians still argue whether Simon was mentally unstable, chronically ill, or simply disinterested in governance. Some think he resented being a puppet. Others say he was content to enjoy the court's pleasures, while Adelaide kept the wolves at bay. But Palermo is restless. Nobles whisper that Simon is unfit, that his mother has overstepped, that the young count is more interested in organizing musical pageants than military campaigns. Then, at age 16, Simon dies. Abruptly, quietly, the cause unclear. Some say fever. Others suspect poison. One particularly juicy rumor claims Adelaide orchestrated his death to pave the way for her other son, Roger II. Yes, that Roger, the one who would become one of the most formidable rulers in medieval Europe. There's no direct evidence. Just the uncomfortable coincidence that Adelaide wasted no time installing Roger II as the new count, then ruling his regency with even more iron in her spine. She restructured Sicily's legal code, elevated Muslim officials to high positions, played the Pope and the Caliphate against each other like chess pieces. And when Roger II finally came of age, she simply handed him the reins. A clean succession, too clean. The Simon chapter became a quiet scandal, an episode court poets didn't write about. A prince who vanished into a footnote. A regent who ruled like a queen. And a crown that passed from one son to another without a single noble raising a sword in protest. Coincidence, competence. Or something darker. You stand now in the faded courtyard of the Palermo Palace. Wind flutters through broken archways. You picture Simon robes too big, crown too heavy, watched always by his mother from the throne behind the throne. It's hard to say whether he died of illness or irrelevance. Either way, he became a cautionary tale, a boy king who never ruled, and a mother who never let go. And Adelaide, she lived on, unshaken, unapologetic, buried eventually in a tomb that names her not her sons as the savior of Sicily. The Sicilian sun fades, and you cross the sea again this time, to a land where the weather is colder, but the blood runs hotter. Welcome to England, somewhere between the twilight of the Anglo-Saxon world and the brewing storm of Norman conquest. You're standing in a candlelit hall of King Ethelred II, better known painfully as Ethelred the Unready. Let's be clear, the nickname's a mistranslation. Unread doesn't mean unprepared, it means poorly advised. So really, he's Ethelred the badly counseled, which if anything, might be worse. And tonight, you'll find out why. Ethelred takes the throne as a boy after the suspicious murder of his older half-brother, King Edward the Martyr. No one admits to the deed, but let's just say Ethelred's mother, Queen Elfthryth, was very nearby when the stabbing happened, and her son's sudden promotion well-timed. Historians still argue whether Ethelred knew, suspected, or simply benefited from his brother's untimely demise. The shadow of that scandal never quite lifts. You enter the royal court around 991. The mood is tense. Viking raids are hitting harder and faster. The Danes are no longer just plundering, they're parking their longships and staying. Ethelred's advisors are split fight or pay, the king chooses, the worst of both. He institutes a tax called the Danegeld, literally Dane money. It's a protection payment to keep the Vikings from pillaging. The logic bribed them to behave. But the problem, it works too well. The Vikings keep coming back like customers at a bakery that gives out free scones to robbers. One particularly awkward moment, Ethelred pays off a Danish fleet in gold and silver, only to have them sail around the coast and ransack another city anyway. You almost feel sorry for him. Almost. Because here's the real scandal, St. Brice's Day massacre. In 1002, Ethelred frustrated and humiliated issues a chilling decree: kill all Danes in England, particularly those living peacefully among his subjects. It's a paranoid move aimed at rooting out imagined spies and traitors. But what unfolds is brutal, indiscriminate bloodshed. In towns like Oxford, even churches become sites of slaughter. Families who'd lived alongside Anglo-Saxons for decades are turned on overnight. The massacre sends shockwaves through the north and reaches the ears of Swine Forkbeard, King of Denmark, whose sister may have been among the victims. Swine's response: invasion. What follows is a long, humiliating war of attrition. Ethelred flees, returns, flees again. He makes alliances, breaks them, begs. The Pope marries a Norman princess and still can't hold the kingdom together. At one point, Swine even takes the throne, becoming King of England, while Ethelred hides out across the Channel, writing increasingly desperate letters that read like medieval Yelp reviews of betrayal. Here's your quirky tidbit in an attempt to ward off bad omens. Ethelred once ordered an entire town to be relocated away from a river bend because a crooked stream was deemed spiritually bad luck. Imagine explaining that to an exhausted peasant carrying their entire cottage on a cart. And yet, you walk among his old estates now and feel a twinge of sympathy. Because Ethelred inherited a crown cracked by murder, surrounded by liars, and besieged by warriors from across the sea. He didn't rule badly because he was cruel. He ruled badly because he was terrified and indecisive. And yes, advised by a council of sycophants more interested in gold than strategy. Historians still debate whether Ethelred was doomed by personality, circumstance, or both. Some say he was simply born a century too late, his style of rule made for a gentler era that didn't exist anymore. He dies in 1016 just as the Danes are closing in again. His son Edmund Ironside fights valiantly but loses to Canute the Great, a Viking who ironically rules with far more wisdom than Ethelred ever mustered. But Ethelred's legacy sticks, a name synonymous with failed leadership, a reminder that fear, once it takes the throne, never rules alone. You glance once more at his empty hall. The fire has gone out. The stones are damp with time. And in the echo of those halls, Ethelred's ghost still wonders what might have happened if just one advisor had told him the truth. You pass through the ruins of Anglo-Saxon misfortune and cross a narrow strait into land ruled by God's ghosts and political gossip sharper than any sword. Welcome to the Kievan Rus, where princes bear names like thunder and scandals echo like church bells through birch forests and snowy hills. And no scandal rings louder than that of Yarapolk, the unfortunate middle child of the early Rus dynasty, a man born to rule undone by family and buried under layers of betrayal so thick you'd think his brothers wrote the ending themselves. You arrive in Kiev around 972, just after the dramatic death of their father, Sviatoslav the Brave, a warlord who spent most of his life fighting the Byzantines and dying in spectacular fashion, ambushed by Pechenegs, who, according to rumor, made a drinking cup out of his skull. Yes, another one. You're keeping a list. That leaves his sons to pick up the crown. Yarapolk the eldest inherits the central and arguably most prestigious part of the Rus realm, Kiev. His younger brothers Oleg and Vladimir get the scraps, the Drevlian lands, and the distant Norse-leaning city of Novgorod. It's not a perfect system, but it's feudalism, so naturally, it implodes immediately. You're seated in Yarapolk's stone hall, watching as messengers arrive hourly with bad news. Oleg, ruling from his western frontier, has started ignoring royal directives. He's building up his army. Tensions boil. The brothers meet, supposedly to talk. What happens next is murky. Some accounts claim it was an accident. Others say Yarapolk's men pushed Oleg from a bridge during a skirmish. Either way, Oleg ends up dead. And now the scandal truly begins. Because Yarapolk, instead of holding a state funeral or begging forgiveness, does something far worse. He claims Oleg's lands for himself. It's a cold move. A royal chess play soaked in fratricide. And someone is watching closely, Vladimir, the youngest brother. Vladimir, who'd been biding his time in Novgorod, now sees an opportunity. He flees to Scandinavia, possibly Iceland or Sweden, gathers a mercenary army, and returns 2 years later with fury in his eyes and silver in his pockets. You ride beside Yarapolk as his spies report Vladimir is coming. Not to negotiate, to avenge. Desperate Yarapolk fortifies his cities, but one by one they fall. Vladimir's forces are brutal, efficient, and loyal, not because they love him, but because he pays them. Yarapolk retreats to Rodin, a heavily defended fortress. There he attempts diplomacy, even sends envoys to the Byzantines begging for support. Here's your mainstream fact: this moment, around 978, is one of the few documented succession crises in early Rus history that clearly combines Viking and Slavic power structures. The blend of Norse-style blood feud and Byzantine-style diplomacy makes it feel both tribal and imperial. But nothing saves Yarapolk. He's lured out of hiding under the promise of peace. His brother's envoy, Blud, convinces him to meet with Vladimir in person. You follow him down the corridor through the stone gate into a dim chamber, supposedly safe. And then, ambush. Yaropolk is murdered in cold blood, stabbed by one of Vladimir's men before he can even speak. Some accounts claim he cried out for Christ. Others say he was caught praying. Either way, his death is swift, brutal, and entirely expected. And the real twist, Vladimir then marries Yaropolk's widow. Yep, to seal the deal. To legitimize his takeover. Possibly to quiet any children of Yaropolk who might someday claim a right to the throne. Spoiler, it doesn't work. That drama will continue for generations. Fringe tidbit. Some later chroniclers claim that Yaropolk had secretly converted to Christianity before his death, perhaps influenced by Byzantine missionaries. If true, it would make him the first Christian ruler of Rus, not Vladimir, who famously converts later and gets all the credit. Historians still argue about this. Was Yaropolk baptized? Was he planning an alliance with Constantinople? Or is this retroactive propaganda designed to make Vladimir look more like a unifier and less like, well, a fratricidal usurper? You stand now at the edge of the Dnieper mist curling around your boots. Across the water bells toll from Kiev's hilltop churches. Vladimir will rule for decades. He'll convert the Rus officially. He'll be remembered as a saint. But in the silence of the river, you hear another name, Yaropolk, echoed only by reeds and ripples. A brother betrayed, a king erased, a scandal buried not in shame, but in silence. The waters of the Dnieper recede behind you as the path twists westward again, toward the spires and smoke of the Holy Roman Empire, not its grand apex, but its groaning, grinding adolescence. And waiting there atop a gilded throne and a mound of paperwork no one actually reads is Emperor Henry IV, a man whose reign is a slow-motion disaster, equal parts high drama, holy war, and petty sabotage. You arrive just in time for the investiture controversy. That sounds dry, right? Like something involving robes and Latin. But don't be fooled. This was a political blood feud between a pope and an emperor, so venomous, so public, that it makes most modern Twitter fights look like toddler disputes over snack time. And the scandal, oh, it's personal. Henry IV becomes King of Germany at age 6. That's barely old enough to tie a boot, let alone manage nobles who stab each other over soup. His early reign is controlled by regents and advisors, many of whom use him like a ventriloquist dummy in a really expensive tunic. By the time Henry actually takes control, he's already surrounded by enemies, rebellious Saxon nobles, a rotating cast of untrustworthy bishops, and of course, the ever-watchful eye of the papacy. Now here's your mainstream fact. The investiture controversy was a 50-year conflict over who got to appoint bishops. The Pope believed only the Church should do it. Henry believed the Emperor had that right. It may sound like a technicality, but in the medieval world, bishops were political weapons. They controlled land armies and taxes. Losing them meant losing power. So when Pope Gregory VII declares that emperors can no longer appoint bishops, Henry doesn't just grumble. He writes the Pope a letter, a mean one. In it, he calls Gregory a false monk, demands his resignation, and signs it King Henry, by the grace of God, not you. That's not sass. That's open war. Gregory responds by excommunicating him. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And excommunication isn't just spiritual awkwardness. It means Henry's vassals are legally freed from obedience. His rule collapses. Civil war breaks out. At one point, the German nobles offer the crown to someone else entirely. Here's your fringe detail. During this mess, Henry is briefly imprisoned by rebellious nobles, including his own wife, Bertha of Savoy, who sides against him twice. Their marriage is less till death do us part, and more until I can find someone better with a sword. But the scene you've come to witness is his most infamous moment, the walk to Canossa. It's January 1077. Henry, desperate to lift his excommunication treks across the Alps barefoot in the snow to the papal castle of Canossa in northern Italy. Yes, barefoot. He wears a hair shirt. He fasts. He stands outside in the freezing cold for 3 days, waiting for the Pope to grant him forgiveness. You picture the emperor, once the most powerful man in Christendom, shivering in slush, while inside Pope Gregory enjoys wine by the fire. Historians still argue whether Gregory's delay was piety or petty power play. Probably both. Eventually, Gregory relents. He lifts the excommunication. Henry returns to Germany and immediately resumes trying to destroy the Pope. You can't make this up. The rest of Henry's reign is a slow unraveling. He invades Italy. He installs an anti-pope that's a fake pope just to spite the real one. Gregory dies in exile, but so does Henry, imprisoned by his own son Henry V, who literally rebels, captures, and dethrones him. Imagine being ousted by your child. That's Shakespearean-level scandal. Henry dies in 1106, alone, unburied. The church refuses to give him a proper burial at first, because he died excommunicated again. His body lies in a crypt in Liège for years before anyone dares move it. But here's the twist. Despite the disasters, Henry's defiance plants the seeds for something bigger. Later emperors continue resisting papal control. Kings across Europe begin to challenge Rome's monopoly on power. The church wins the investiture controversy, but loses the illusion of invincibility. You stand now in the snows of Canossa, where the ghost of a barefoot emperor still lingers. Not proud, not broken, just human, caught between God and crown throne and altar pride and desperation. And you realize that sometimes the greatest scandal isn't the fall from grace, it's how far someone is willing to crawl back to reclaim it. You step away from the cold penitence of Canossa and into something altogether hotter, both in climate and temperament. The land is Sicily again, but the year is later now, the cast richer, and the scandal, oh the scandal, twice as layered. Tonight you meet a man born in a palace, but forged in fire. Roger II, the boy who inherited a kingdom, and with a little help from the shadows turned it into an empire. This tale begins where another ended, the mysterious death of his brother, Count Simon. Remember the leopard incident, the sudden illness, the whispered suspicions about a mother pulling strings from behind embroidered veils. Yes, that mother, Adelaide del Vasto, is still here, regal and unstoppable, and Roger is now her golden child. At just 9 years old, he becomes Count of Sicily. But don't let the age fool you. Roger II is raised on power, weaned on politics, and swaddled in scandal. Adelaide keeps him close, surrounds him with Greek scribes, Muslim mathematicians, and Norman knights, crafting a court where languages mix like spices and treason simmers just under the silk. By his teenage years, Roger is already making moves, but it's his adulthood that lights the fuse. In 1130, he does something outrageous. He declares himself King of Sicily. Now, technically, Sicily isn't supposed to have a king. It's a patchwork of duchies and principalities loosely stitched together since the Norman conquest. But Roger wants more than loyalty. He wants legitimacy. So he calls in favors, buys papal approval from a cash-strapped Pope Anacletus II, who just happens to be an anti-pope. That's right. Roger gets crowned by the wrong pope. Cue the scandal. The real Pope Innocent II loses his holy mind. He excommunicates Roger, denounces the coronation, and calls on the Holy Roman Emperor and a fleet of rival princes to undo it. Suddenly, Roger's kingdom is under siege, not just from armies, but from the heavens. Here's your mainstream fact: Roger the Tuck spends the next 2 decades fighting off invasions while also building one of the most advanced bureaucracies in Europe. His kingdom is multicultural, multi-faith, and terrifyingly efficient. He has Arab scientists designing maps, Jewish doctors advising him on medicine, and Byzantine architects shaping his palaces. But don't mistake tolerance for softness. Roger puts down rebellions with the ruthlessness of a man who knows he's walking a tightrope over a pit of daggers. At one point, when a noble family tries to defect to the Pope's camp, Roger doesn't just execute the leaders, he has their homes razed and their names erased from legal memory. That's medieval cancel culture at its most thorough. And here's your fringe tidbit. Roger allegedly kept a private room filled with mechanical devices designed by Muslim inventors, clocks, celestial spheres, even a working fountain that shot water in synchronized patterns during evening feasts. Think of it as a 12th century prototype of the Bellagio, with more decapitations nearby. Still, the biggest scandal of his reign isn't his wars or his gadgets. It's that he wins. Despite being crowned by a fake pope, despite open rebellion from his own nobles, despite literal holy war declared against him, Roger not only survives, he thrives. He turns Sicily into a powerhouse of learning, art, and maritime dominance. Historians still argue how to label him. Was he a usurper who manipulated a schism to gain a crown, or a visionary who used the chaos of Christendom to create something unprecedented? Some call him a heretic in king's robes. Others see him as a medieval prototype for the Renaissance ruler, curious, secular, and annoyingly competent. You stroll through the golden halls of the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, one of Roger's crowning architectural achievements. The ceilings glitter with Byzantine mosaics. The floors reflect Arab geometry. Latin prayers echo beneath Greek icons. It's not a palace. It's a statement. A reminder that in an age of closed minds and sharpened blades, Roger built something radical, a kingdom where scandal wasn't a stain, it was a strategy. And as the incense curls upward into the domes above, you realize Roger didn't just survive his scandal. He wrote history with it. The golden glow of Palermo dims behind you, and now you step into the forests of Saxony, wet leaves underfoot, the smell of damp wool, and somewhere in the distance, war drums beating in the name of ambition. Because tonight, you're going to meet one of the most volatile figures of the 11th century, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, a man who ruled like a king, defied actual kings, and paid the price in a scandal that shook the Holy Roman Empire to its roots. You find him on horseback, dressed in crimson and steel, surveying his lands like a chessboard. And make no mistake, he doesn't own these duchies. He is them. His influence stretches from the North Sea to the Alps, his armies are loyal, and his arrogance unmatched. And that's the problem. Henry is the great-grandson of Welf I, part of the powerful Welf dynasty, and cousin to the man who sits on the imperial throne, Frederick Barbarossa. At first they're allies. Cousins, yes, but also partners in empire. Henry supports Frederick's early campaigns, even helps him claim the Italian crown. Their relationship is more bromance than blood feud, until it isn't. See, Henry wants one thing: more land, specifically Duchy of Saxony expanded into Slavic territory and full royal autonomy within Germany. He builds cities: Munich, Lübeck, Brunswick. He patronizes cathedrals and fortresses alike. In some ways, he's a proto-modernizer, but in others, he's a walking red flag. When Frederick launches one of his infamous campaigns into Italy, hoping to bring those pesky city-states under control, he calls on Henry for reinforcements. Henry refuses, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. His reasoning: he won't risk his army unless he gets more territory. Basically, give me more duchies or march without me. It's an ultimatum. Frederick is stunned. Henry has just turned a family favor into a power play. And that's not just scandalous, it's treasonous. Here's your mainstream fact. In 1180, Frederick convenes an imperial court and charges Henry with insubordination. He strips him of his duchies, both Saxony and Bavaria, and orders him into exile. For a man who once ruled a third of the empire, this is a nuclear-level demotion. But the real scandal, Henry refuses to go quietly. He launches a rebellion, rallies his loyalists. The war that follows is brutal: castles, razed towns, blockaded bishops caught in the crossfire. Henry's forces lose, but not without burning a few bridges and abbeys on the way down. And now your quirky fringe tidbit while in exile in England. Yes, England, Henry befriends King Henry II, and possibly goes hawking with Thomas Becket's ghost still lingering somewhere nearby. He marries the king's daughter Matilda, linking the Welfs to the Plantagenets, an alliance that will haunt European politics for the next century. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Frederick redistributes Henry's lands to loyal nobles, crushing any hope of a comeback. But Henry isn't done. After several years abroad, he negotiates a partial return, allowed to keep Brunswick his family seat, but nothing else. No duchy, no crown, just a title and a chipped throne. He spends his final years in quiet bitterness, or depending on who you ask, quiet planning. Historians still argue whether Henry the Lion was a visionary ahead of his time, championing regional identity against imperial overreach, or a dangerously proud noble who mistook his ambition for divine right. You wander through Brunswick now, past statues and remnants of what was once a ducal capital. Locals still speak of the Lion not as a villain, but a tragic hero betrayed by empire, exiled by politics, and remembered for what he built, not what he lost. And yet the scandal remains. A cousin who defied an emperor. A duke who dared to crown himself in action, if not title. A legacy written not in royal ink, but in rebellious fire. The road grows quiet now. You walk through pine forests where the wind carries no banners, no hymns, just the hush of endings. Tonight's final figure waits for you on a windswept plain in Central Europe beneath a sky smeared gray with smoke and secrets. His name is Bela III, King of Hungary, and though his scandal isn't the loudest, it might be the most heartbreaking. Because sometimes the most dangerous rulers aren't the brutal ones. They're the ones who play nice until they don't. You find Bela seated in his court at Esztergom 1170s. Robes, immaculate eyes, sharp fingers tapping a golden seal onto a document written in 3 languages. Latin for Rome, Greek for Constantinople, Old Hungarian for the home crowd. He's a diplomat, a linguist, a king with a scholar's spine and a warrior's stare. But beneath that polished exterior, the scars of betrayal. Let's rewind. Bela was born a younger son, royalty, but not in line for the Hungarian throne. Instead, he's sent to Constantinople, where he's raised among Byzantine elites. There he becomes known as Alexios, even designated as heir to the emperor. He lives in the palace, marries a Byzantine princess, learns the art of power by candlelight and politics through whispered Greek. Then suddenly, poof, his future disappears. The emperor has a new son. Bela is unadopted, unengaged, and quietly shoved aside. His marriage is annulled, his title stripped, his palace room reassigned. It's an imperial breakup, and he's ghosted in 4 dialects. So Bela returns to Hungary humbled, but not broken. And then something unthinkable happens. His brother, the actual king, dies. Bela, once a footnote, becomes king of Hungary. That's when things get spicy. He immediately sets about reforming the kingdom, modernizing the administration, standardizing coinage, building a chancellery modeled after the Byzantines. He introduces Greek court rituals, Latin legal codes, Arabic medicine. He's not just ruling, he's importing empire. But the scandal, it's domestic. Bela's own wife, Agnes of Antioch, is more than a queen. She's a power broker, a patron of monastic orders, and possibly, if whispers are to be believed, a secret string puller. Some claim she used her position to enrich her family back in the Crusader states. Others say she deliberately sabotaged rival nobles in Hungary through forged documents and false charges. There's even one account that she had an entire convent relocated because the abbess refused to include her name in morning prayers. The truth, probably less dramatic, but definitely political. Here's your mainstream fact. Bela III oversaw the drafting of the first surviving royal charter in Hungary, a landmark document that placed the king's authority squarely over that of the church. He wasn't just centralizing power, he was setting the tone for a new kind of monarchy, one with fewer bishops and more accountants. But power like that creates enemies. At one point, Bela is accused of attempting to poison his own son-in-law, who dared to question royal policy. There's no proof. But the incident ends with said son-in-law quietly sent abroad and replaced by someone more agreeable. Fringe tidbit: Bela kept a collection of Byzantine relics, including a piece of what was claimed to be St. John's jawbone, which he had mounted in gold and used as a debating charm during court discussions. Anyone holding it had the floor. A sacred microphone, basically. But for all his reforms and rituals, Bela never forgets how he was betrayed in Constantinople. He plays friendly with Byzantium, yes, but always at a distance. He never remarries into the imperial family. He signs treaties only when necessary. And when his chance comes to support a rival claimant to the Byzantine throne, he funds it quietly, generously, and with interest. Historians still debate whether Bela was a truly independent king or simply a product of two empires clashing through him. Some paint him as a puppet who cut his own strings. Others say he ruled with such quiet calculation that the real scandal was how little anyone noticed the dagger until it struck. You stand now outside the royal tomb at Shekes Fehervar. No crown atop it, no dramatic epitaph, just a stone slab and the weight of a man who learned too early that kingship isn't about revenge, it's about patience. And patience, that's the slowest, coldest scandal of them all. You've wandered through halls lit by flickering torches, stumbled across blood-soaked crowns, ducked past whispered betrayals, and tiptoed over the bones of kings. You've seen child emperors played like pawns, popes turned party hosts, and warriors who ruled not with armies, but with quiet, calculated vengeance. Now, you breathe out. The storm has passed. The scandals you've just heard weren't just gossip. They were echoes of real lives, flawed, fascinating, and deeply human. Rulers in the Dark Ages didn't reign from ivory towers. They bled, they schemed, they whispered, married, bribed, and sometimes fell in the most spectacular fashion. But you survived it all. So as you settle under your blanket, your mind still spinning with popes in armor and emperors in snow, just remember, history isn't dusty, it's alive. Every kingdom you crossed, every scandal you uncovered, that was someone's life, someone's risk, someone's midnight secret. Let that thought lull you. Let the past sink down like soft earth beneath your feet. The noise quiets. The hallways empty. The voices of long-dead kings and queens fade into silence. And all that remains is the hush of night, the whisper of pages turning, and the slow, gentle rhythm of sleep. You made it to the end. End of script. Sweet dreams.